Hi everyone. This is like literally my third attempt at recording this, but I think I have it down now. All right, so this is our first sort of practice mini lecture here. Though as long as all the grades are decent, the grades will count. So don't worry about that. But basically, this is sort of an introduction to the Cold War. I know you guys have already read the chapter and you did your discussion board where you assessed how good of a president Harry S. Truman was. But now I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about it and hopefully get another mini lecture up this week that'll sort of wrap this whole thing up. So this is the introduction to the Cold War. Basically, the Cold War is going to be a war between the United States and Soviet Union that's not an actual war. And we're going to sort of clarify what that means. The major players in the Cold War are going to be the United States, and this is Harry S. Truman, the President of the United States, from the death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1945 through 1952. And then Joseph Stalin, who is going to be the premier of the Soviet Union through 1954. So those are the two that are going to sort of play a role in the start of the Cold War. And we can't leave Winston Churchill over here out. Though Great Britain will no longer be a great world power, Churchill will still play a significant role, particularly in the early days of the Cold War. So, what is the essential question when you talk about the Cold War? It's what made the growing tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union evolve into a Cold War. So, basically, we have to figure out is what actually created this tension. What made it so that the United States and the Soviet Union are going to go at each other for over 40 years. And ultimately, we can bring this back to the question of the atom bomb. The idea of when the United States made the decision to drop the atom bomb, yes, it was to end the war with Japan, but the reality was it was to send a message to the Soviet Union because the Soviets were supposed to declare war on Japan on August 8th, 1945. It's not a coincidence that we dropped the first bomb on August 6th and then the second one on August 9th. So there's no need for the Soviets to get involved in Japan. We knew what the Japanese were doing in Europe. I'm not sorry, not the Japanese. We knew what the Soviets were doing in Eastern Europe. You know, as they went through Poland, as they went into the former Yugoslavia, as they went into Eastern Germany, they weren't liberating those countries. They were taking that land over and bringing it under their sphere of influence. And the United States was terrified that the Soviets would do that throughout Asia, which is one of the reasons why we needed to end the war with Japan on our terms. We could not share the victory with the Soviets. So ultimately, the tension that's going to evolve between the United States and the Soviet Union is going to be about nuclear weapons and who was going to have the ability to destroy who. All right, so that's really what we're ultimately looking at. So, who are the major players in the United States throughout the Cold War? Well, the first thing to realize is that the Cold War is going to go on for a very, very long time. So, we're talking many, many, many different presidents. Of course, it starts with Harry S. Truman, the guy right here. He was an interesting guy. He never wanted to get into politics. He was actually a haberdasher by trade, meaning a hat maker, who just sort of fell into local politics as he got older and then ultimately just found himself in favor of the Democratic Party and ended up being Franklin Delano Roosevelt's vice president. And whether fortunately or unfortunately, he was the vice president when Franklin Delano Roosevelt passed away. Roosevelt had several vice presidents throughout his 4 terms. And so Harry S. Truman was sort of thrust into the spotlight of the world stage, whether he wanted to be there or not. And he's really the American president that lays the groundwork for the Cold War. Following Harry S. Truman in 1952, from 1952 to 1960, is going to be Dwight D. Eisenhower. Of course, Dwight D. Eisenhower is best known as being the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe during World War II. So he was the war hero. And he's really the guy that's going to carry us through the 1950s. The 1950s were a time period of great economic prosperity in the United States, but it was also a time period of incredible unrest in the United States. You're really talking the heart of the civil rights movement is the 1950s. And Eisenhower is sort of the one that walked us through all of that. People debate how good of a president he actually was. But the reality was, people were sort of happy under him. So that's Dwight D. Eisenhower. Richard Nixon, of course, who will become president eventually, is Eisenhower's vice president from 1952 to 1960. After Eisenhower, we're going to have the young John F. Kennedy who will be elected. John F. Kennedy will be the youngest president ever elected. Teddy Roosevelt was the youngest president to ever serve, but Kennedy will be the youngest ever elected. And he really represented that new energy, the youth of America in the 1960s. And, you know, he came into the presidency with a great deal of fanfare. He and Jackie Kennedy, his wife, and his children, they really sort of represented almost American royalty. People looked at them as people bigger than life. Of course, John F. Kennedy had a fairly scandalous presidency. And we'll get into him more into detail, but he had plenty of affairs and stuff like that while he was in office. And his brother, Robert F. Kennedy, will also play a significant role in all of that. John F. Kennedy is also the one that really sort of gets us truly embroiled in the Vietnam War. He's also the one that a lot of the stuff with Cuba will play out with, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Bay of Pigs. However, I would say that he's not really the blame for the Cuba stuff. He sort of inherited the Cuba stuff. That all started under Eisenhower because of the fact that Fidel Castro will take over Cuba in 1959, and Cuba will become communist. And oh my God, we don't want the commies near us. So that's John F. Kennedy. When John F. Kennedy is assassinated in 1963, Lyndon Baines Johnson, this guy right here, is going to take over. Lyndon Baines Johnson, he was a politician from Texas, which is significant, the fact that he is a Southern president, because he's really the one where he will be the one in charge when the bulk of the civil rights legislation will pass. So a Southerner is in the presidential office when a lot of the civil rights stuff happens. But also Lyndon Baines Johnson is also the one that gets us really embroiled in Vietnam. Almost to the point of no return. And we'll talk a lot about him when we get to the Vietnam War. The picture is sort of, I don't know why this happened, but the picture is blocked of Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon will take over after Lyndon Baines Johnson. Nixon will be elected in 1968, and he'll be president from 1968. He'll be reelected in 72, and he'll be forced to resign in 73 as a result of Watergate. Richard Nixon's an interesting character because of the fact that, a lot of people see him as a negative person in history because of Watergate, but the reality is he actually does quite a bit of good when it comes to international affairs, and we'll see that as the Cold War develops. After Nixon, Gerald Ford will become president. Gerald Ford's picture isn't even up here. Gerald Ford is the only American president to not be elected in any way, shape, or form. He wasn't elected as vice president. He became Nixon's vice president because Nixon's first vice president, Spiro Agnew, is going to be forced to resign. And then he becomes president because Nixon is forced to resign. So he sort of became president by accident. And he sort of becomes the butt of a lot of jokes. He was the one that was president when Saturday Night Live began, and he was sort of the first president that they went after. He was president for a short period of time until 76, when Jimmy Carter, this guy right down here, he will be elected president. He'll be a one-term president from 76 to 80. His presidency is an interesting presidency. When we get into like the mid 70s ish, the United States goes into a real dark time. We've just gotten out of the Vietnam War. We're really in an economic crisis. Inflation is incredibly high. We're going to have hostages taken in Iran in 1978. Here we are, the mighty United States, and students in Iran are taking our people hostage. And those years are just not going to be a real positive time for us. Because of that, Carter will be a one-term president. He'll serve from 76 to 80. And of course, in 80, Ronald Reagan will be elected. And Reagan will be president from 80 to 88. And he is really the president that gets us out of the Cold War. Reagan actually is a pretty significant president. We'll talk a lot more about him, obviously, when we get to the 80s. Now, the Cold War basically is when the U.S. engages in a conflict of ideas with the Soviet Union. in order to limit the spread of communism throughout the world. We literally lived in fear of communism expanding because God forbid the ideas of communism spread throughout North America and into the United States. That would get in the way of our capitalist system. We want our money. We want to be free to make our money, and communism was going to stop us from being able to do that. So ultimately, the Cold War is going to be about that, us sort of engaging with the Soviets, trying to stop communism from spreading. But the reality is the biggest threat with the Cold War was the nuclear arms race. Both countries are building as many nuclear weapons as they possibly can, and we're threatening each other with them at all times. You have the concept of MAD, M-A-D, mutually assured destruction. The idea that neither one of us would ever actually use the nuclear weapon, because if we launched a nuclear weapon against the Soviet Union, they would have enough time to launch one against us and we would both be destroyed. So that's really part of the reason why it is a Cold War. Again, like I said, ultimately, we want the free market economy. We want to be able to make as much money as we can. We don't want anybody stopping us from that. And of course, the communists don't want that. They're talking about equality and stuff like that. The reality is, Soviet communism was never about equality. Soviet communism was about authoritarianism and dictatorship. It was about control of the people, control of the market. It really wasn't about equality. Now, the U.S. sought to achieve this security through creating a number of different alliance systems. The first one that we create is NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. We create this shortly after World War II ends. And basically, this is taking the Western European nations and the United States and creating an alliance to sort of bind us together to sort of stop the Soviet spread. In response to that, the Soviets create the Warsaw Pact. And the Warsaw Pact is basically the Eastern European countries' version of NATO. In addition to that, we also see the creation of the United Nations. The United Nations was created in response to the fact that the League of Nations was a failure. The League of Nations did not stop World War II from happening. So we had to do something to make sure that no other world war could ever occur. Of course, the goal of the League of Nations is for peacekeeping. We don't want to we want to solve problems. We don't want to let somebody like an Adolf Hitler or Benito Mussolini ever rise again. There were 51 nations that were part of the original United Nations. Today, there's many, many more than that. The United Nations has two main bodies, the General Assembly, which is all members are part of that and all can vote. And you have the Security Council, which has 15 members, 10 of which rotate in the Big Five. The United States, the Soviet Union, known as Russia today, Great Britain, China, and France are permanent members, and they all have veto power, so they can all stop anything from happening. So again, we have things like the Warsaw Pact and NATO and the United Nations, which in the ultimate goal is to stop issues from happening, but in some ways they start to create more issues, and we'll see how that happens as we move forward. There are countries that are not part of any of this. We're primarily talking about Africa, Latin America, and Asia. The reality is most of these nations that are orange on this map were actually European colonies at one point. And when World War II ended, the European nations could no longer control it. So what you end up sort of see happening is a little bit of chaos created in this area of the world. And they sort of become a little bit of a battleground between the communists and us in the democratic nations. The United States and the Soviets had been allies during World War II, but that was the idea of you got to keep your friends close, but your enemies closer, or the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So we did work together during World War II, but it was a stressful alliance. We never really trusted each other during this time period. And that was really just setting the stage for what was going to happen when it was all over. Now, what were the basic policies the U.S. has after World War II? One, collective security, the idea of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and CETO, which is the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. Collective security is the idea that we're going to work together to stop the spread of communism. International aid, we have the Marshall Plan. George Marshall, who you read about in your text, who was the Secretary of State, came up with this idea that if we pump tons of money into Europe, the Europeans that are not part of the communist bloc at this point will stay on our side. They're not going to turn to the communists.